that maybe gravity might be something to study, not just, you know, not just something to say you pick up something and drop it, but actually something that you could actually formally study, and that some of the crazy predictions of gravity included objects that are so dense and compact that nothing can escape them. And when I first heard about black holes, which I'm sure is an experience many of you can relate to, they weirded me out. I did not like the idea that black holes were something you could never escape from. You know, so hearing about wormholes and you know baby universes inside and things like that, that kind of interested me as well, because you know this is a way to kind of get around the idea that black holes are the end of everything. And I've not seen Interstellar yet, so don't spoil it. I did see The Black Hole though. Anybody else see that one? They go to the bad guys go through the black hole and end up in hell. That one is not. Yeah, it's literally true. The demonic robot standing over flames with, but this was my first inkling. But the thing was that at the time, when I was about 12, I started thinking about this, and then I thought, you know, I really don't like math enough to be an astrophysicist, to study general relativity. PhD later, I found that I was wrong. I found that I liked math a lot. Once I convinced myself that math was okay to like, which is a little hard to do sometimes. I mean, again, that may be an experience that many of you have had. That maybe you loved math, but you kind of felt that it wasn't okay to do it, or maybe you were told that you have to love math above all else or something, or else you shouldn't even try, rather than seeing it as something that you can do. You don't have to necessarily love it with your whole being, but it's something you're capable of doing because you're smart. This is something that we have to remember as well when we talk about science, is that many people's experience is they've been told you can't do science. You're a girl, you have the wrong skin color, okay? This is a message that is very strong in our culture. And it's one that we need to remember that it's there, we swim in it. So I like this quote from Colbert. I figure this is appropriate for transitioning to talking about why I went off, went to college, went to graduate school at Rutgers, and ended up studying what I said I wasn't smart enough to study. And I do most of my writing on the internet, which means I have to include cats. It's one of the immutable laws of nature now. I just had to pick the right cat. After graduate school, I actually followed I did my dutiful thing and went off to teach at a variety of colleges. I started at New Jersey Institute of Technology, which several of you have talked to today do solar physics, so that was the closest I've ever come to solar physics, was being in the same building as solar physicists. Then I taught at a college called Lambeth University in Tennessee, and ran the planetarium attached to the university there. And I left there because the college closed. I don't recommend that career option. And then I proceeded to a temporary position, faculty position at Randolph-Macon College in Virginia, and decided at that point that I was done with temporary positions. But while I was teaching at Randolph-Macon, I made a very important discovery about myself. I taught a class called Science versus Pseudoscience. It was a class I designed, class basically on skepticism, but we talked about astrology, we talked about creationism, and we just basically talked about what is science and why is science different from things that kind of carry the same, some of the same language as science, that claim to be alternatives to scientific results. But part of the class was the students had to write. It was a class for non-scientists, and it had a significant writing portion to it. And I said to myself, okay, my students have to write for this class, so I'm going to write too. So I started a blog. 4 years later, I am a full-time professional writer from that blog because I found I really liked writing. I had done a lot of writing as a kid, you know, the kind of things that you write when you're a kid, stories about dragons, and not that adults don't enjoy stories about dragons. It seems like particularly kids like writing them, and then they decide later on that, you know, they can't make a living out of it, so they won't do it anymore. But I found that I really liked writing, and I really liked writing about science. And the reason is encapsulated in this quote from particle physicist Tony Z. I have a compelling need to explain. And writing is a really great way to do that. And part of that for me is I don't fully understand something unless I can explain it to somebody else. If anybody's taught, you may know that too. You really know if you understand something or not if you can explain it to a room full of disinterested undergraduates. Or even interested undergraduates who happen to be confused. Because if you get confused, they get triply confused. So that is one of the best ways to learn something, is to teach a class in it, to write an essay on it, to try to explain it to somebody who hasn't the first clue about what's going on. Then you understand it. Even if they don't, by the end of it, you understand it. And so ultimately, I would say writing is, in a way, a very selfish act for me. I write because I need to explain, and I need to explain because I need to explain first and foremost to myself. So what does a professional science writer do? A lot of what I do, I'm a freelancer, which means I don't write for a single publication. Well, actually, I write a weekly column for a website called The Daily Beast. I just filed a story this morning. It's a good thing about being in it. My brain is on the Eastern time zone, even though I'm in the Mountain time zone. So I woke up way too early this morning and wrote and filed a story. So if my editor is watching, yes, I wrote it all this morning. Beyond that, what I have to do is I have to identify stories. I have to identify papers, usually, that look interesting. And then I have to go to a publication, to an editor at a publication, and say, I would like to write a story about this paper or this result or this idea. Here's why it is cool and why people would be interested in reading about it. That's not always an easy task, because you're not trying to just identify cool science. You're also trying to convince somebody else that they should pay you to write about it. And so there is a sort of a sweet spot, sort of an intersection between the stuff that really, really excites me and the stuff that I can convince other people they should give me good money to try to excite other people about it. So sometimes that ends up bringing me to write about some really interesting topics, like the idea, is the universe we inhabit a simulation? Okay, well, that's an idea that's been thrown around quite a bit, but there's a group of physicists who figured that they had a way to test this idea. Basically, they're saying, okay, what we do when we set out to simulate the physics of nuclei, atomic nuclei, we pretend that those nuclei are actually, the particles actually exist on a lattice. Okay, it's called lattice quantum chromodynamics. That's a term that probably some of you have heard, at least. They're saying, well, what if the simulation we inhabit is similarly coarse-grained on some level? In other words, at some deep level, below the level of the everyday, we are on a programmed grid. And that would be a way to say, okay, we found the limits of the simulation we inhabit. Because if we did live on a grid, it would violate certain laws like relativity. Because relativity assumes that you can, rotate, you can Lorentz contract and time dilate and all sorts of fun things like that. A lattice has special directions associated with it that would break relativity. Okay, this would only be visible at very, very high energies, but that means we could put limits on that. Now, whether or not you think that this is a convincing argument or not, it was an interesting because it's an intersection of the kind of late night insomniac dorm room discussions that you have, like, dude, what if the universe was like all one big computer simulation? But also a really serious, that's the kind of dorm room conversation that serious philosophers have as well. Actually, there may be a stronger intersection in that than we like to admit many times. But it was also an idea that people set out to try to test. So this was not a story that I would have necessarily thought, oh, this is my favorite thing to write about ever. But I learned a lot writing it because, one, I had to read some philosophy papers, which I would not go out of my way to do. And then I read some nuclear physics papers. And then I turned all of this into an essay in a very philosophically oriented science magazine called Eon. It was a lot of fun. And to date, it remains one of the most read things I've ever written. Most of my stories don't work that way. Most of them are, let's grab a press release that comes out this week, dig into it, see if there's anything worth writing about, send it along to an editor and say, hey, I'd like to cover this. Editor says, thumbs up, thumbs down. And if they say thumbs up, all's good, write it up. And it appears. And I keep doing this until I've written enough to pay the next month's rent. I do not recommend freelancing if you think it's going to be easy. Okay? It is rewarding. It's incredibly rewarding. But it is not something, do not choose to go into freelancing because you think it's going to be easier than the academic life. You should want to do it. You should want to write if you are going to be a freelance writer. You have to love writing, and I love writing. In fact, I just love talking about science. If you could just pay me to talk about science, just stand and talk about it or write about it, whatever, that would make me very happy. Such a job doesn't exist, so I write. Now, this is an experiment I did, and the results just were published yesterday. Called the story that Twitter wrote. I use Twitter quite a bit. Now, I know a lot of people look down on it because it can seem frivolous, and in fact, the frivolity can be a lot of fun, but that's not what I primarily use Twitter for. Primarily, I use Twitter to connect with other people, to talk about the writing I do, and to find out what other people are doing. And so last month, I sent out a tweet saying, planetary scientists, if you could pick a mission, it doesn't have to be a real mission, but it has to be a realistic mission, to any world in the solar system, what would you pick? And I got flooded with responses. I picked 5 and wrote up an article for Slate, slate.com, and it was published yesterday. Among those was the Titan Mare Explorer, which you may have heard of. It's a boat. Since Titan is the only world we know of other than Earth to have liquid surface water that persists, liquid surface
Something.
Something, yeah. Say what? Hey, we have seas, lakes, whatever you want to say. You're having a boat is a logical idea. So that was one. And so I talked to Sarah Hurst, who is an unabashed Titan fan about that. And then I spoke to Bobak Mohawk guy Ferdosi about the Europa Clipper project. But also 3 other scientists. I talked to Michelle Bannister about the possibility of sending a Cassini-type mission to Neptune. That was one that it came up a lot, by the way. Planetary scientists really like the idea of sending a long-term probe to Uranus and or Neptune. And for good reason, because there are a lot of exoplanets of that weight class, and probably similar chemistry out there. Okay, we don't know a lot about these worlds in our own solar system. So there was a lot of interest expressed in that kind of mission. There was a lot of interest expressed in doing some serious Mars-scale studies of Venus, which have not yet been performed. So I talked to David Grinspoon about that one, Dr. Funky Spoon. At a conference last winter, he and I were both there, and we were joking that we were going to get Elvis Costello to show up, and we'd just have a musical act together. But as I said before, I've been doing this a little while, not long compared to many of the people I know. I know people who have been doing science journalism, science communication for many years. This is my 3rd year, finishing my 3rd year of being a full-time science writer. And I think right now I'm just starting to figure out how it works. So I'm going to tell you what I've learned and what I've yet to learn. And I hope maybe to kind of, I don't know, give a little bit of advice, even if it falls into the don't do what I did. Start with this quote from John Baez, that lying is an important pedagogical technique. Now, I didn't put the whole quote. He says, it's okay to lie as long as you tell people you're lying. And this doesn't just go for teaching. This goes for science writing and for communication. One of the hardest things to do as scientists, and I say this as somebody who's gone through it myself, the first thing you want to do is to tell somebody everything. Give them not only the information, the bare minimum of information, but all the background, all the details, all the side alleys, be as precise as possible. We're trained to be precise, to tell everything exactly, okay? That is a horrible idea when you're talking to the general public. Not because it's a bad thing in and of itself, but because it is too easy to get bogged down in the details and miss the fact that not everybody has the same background. We have a lot of training under our belts. We have a lot of jargon that we've learned. We have done a lot of things wrong and a lot of things right, but the main thing is we've had a lot of education. So I'm going to start with getting it wrong. All the ways that I've done it wrong, and other people have too. So as you can tell, I love comics. Maturity is knowing you're an idiot in the past. If that's true, then wisdom is knowing you're going to be an idiot in the future. So one of the first things that we have to remember, and this is a hard lesson, so I wanted to start with it first. Science is part of the culture. Now, I used to use this song quote in teaching, and I won't use it anymore. In fact, I'm showing it to you as an example of what not to do. Okay? This is a song by Warren Zevon, who's well known as a paragon of clean living. So if anybody knows who he is, you're laughing. But he's telling a truth about Einstein, that he was a philanderer who did not treat many women very well. Einstein is not alone in that, but Zevon is kind of being admiring of this. Okay, well, you know, that's kind of cute if you think about it from, oh, tee hee, this isn't such a big deal. It probably was kind of a bigger deal to the women he was interacting with, especially to his family. As many of you are no doubt aware, last week, wow, it's 2 weeks ago now, when the Philae lander landed on, well, bounced off the surface of Comet 67P, the project leader chose to wear a very unfortunate shirt. Okay, that was very distracting. All of a sudden, the event became as much about his shirt as it was about the science. He probably hadn't thought very hard about it, but it was a sign, a very clear sign, that scientists are human beings and they screw up. And when they screw up, all of a sudden, science stops looking like something that is, you know, done by, you know, gods that walk among us, and becomes all of a sudden something that people who are very fallible are doing. Okay? When a scientist behaves badly, it reflects on science. Has anybody read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? Has anybody read that book? Highly recommended. Henrietta Lacks was an African-American woman who had a type of cancer, and when she went to the hospital to be treated, they cultured some of her cells without her knowledge or permission, and that is the basis for a great deal of cancer research ever since. Okay? No consent was obtained, but because the medical culture chose to treat her as somebody that they could do with what they would, they extracted these cells. Okay? Now that's an important thing, because now, as the book goes into in great detail, now medical science is having to deal with all the ethical questions that it didn't deal with when it first treated her, including the problems of treating non-privileged populations as being subject rather than full participants in the scientific process. If somebody takes a culture from you, you have to sign release forms. Okay? But again, that was a case where science behaved wrongly. Even though many people benefited from this, it was handled badly, and it reflects badly on science when this happens. So one more example. How many of you have this book? Say, this may be the wrong crowd for this book, but I'm a general relativity guy. This is the Sears catalog of actually that one isn't even that metaphor doesn't even work anymore. When was the last Sears catalog? This is can't even say you can't even say phone book anymore. But this is like the compendium of general relativity. But each section is divided into parts, major subject matter. And each one of those parts begins with in which the reader goes on some knight-errant mission to study, to do something with this damsel of general relativity, gendering the researcher of general relativity is male, and the subject of study is female. Okay, now that's kind of a cute thing in a certain light, but kind of weird in another. Because of course, you know, scientists aren't all male, nor is everybody heterosexual. It's a very, very weird choice of metaphor if you think about it in that light. And yet, here it is part of a book on general relativity, which, you know, we like to think has nothing to do with any of that. So when you start becoming aware of things like this, it makes you a little more careful. And so I say all this because this is stuff that I've gotten wrong, many other people have gotten wrong. And it is important to be aware of it, not just aware of what you're saying, but how it is heard by other people. Now, another one that's interesting is, this is a lot lighter. So we've moved away from the heavy stuff. We can go back to the heavy stuff at question and answer time. Another thing that we run into is sometimes the metaphors we've been taught in science when we've taken classes are actually pretty lousy metaphors. One I would like to see perish from the earth is the rubber sheet metaphor for space-time. This is great if you have a non-rotating black hole. It's great if you have things that don't change in time. But it's a horrible metaphor as soon as you have a dynamic space-time. And so sometimes when you're talking to the public, the flaws in the metaphors that we've all received, okay, the raisins in the rising bread dough for expansion of space-time, I'm trying to think of other metaphors that we all learned and maybe we've all used. When you start trying to explain them to non-scientists in a non-mathematical context, you realize maybe these metaphors aren't so great after all. So it does not hurt to re-examine the metaphors and say, maybe we should find other ones. Maybe we should think of other ways to explain this stuff. Anytime I can use XKCD is a good day too. And anytime I can use Calvin and Hobbes is even better. Jargon. Jargon sometimes is considered to be the most evil thing in the world. I don't agree. But here's the deal. Jargon is vocabulary. We use jargon because it saves time. We don't have to say every time we talk about, molecules containing carbon, we can say organic instead. We can say, we can start talking about cosmic inflation. We can start talking about polarization. We can start talking about all sorts of things like that, which is all jargon. It's all vocabulary of science, but it doesn't necessarily have the same meaning in daily life. Inflation means something very different to a lot of people than it does to a cosmologist. Polarization refers to cultural attitudes, not to the orientation of electric fields, to the vast majority of people you might be talking to. But it's okay to use those terms as long as you explain what you're doing. Okay? Define your terms. Don't assume people have a shared language with you. But once you start explaining that language, you have actually made your audience your colleague. You've brought them in. Okay? That is one of the most important lessons that I keep trying to teach myself. The notion that jargon is not a barrier, it's an opportunity to help people feel that they're involved, that they're part of it. And I also like to say quark, 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 quark. And then the usual response to this is, well, doesn't talking to non-scientists require dumbing down? All right, and I see some grimaces. That's a good thing. I would like you to take that part of your brain, cut a hole in your skull, take a laser, and cut out the part of your brain that contains the phrase dumbing down. This is the evilest phrase. Do not even think it anymore. Because the moment you think your audience is dumb, you've lost. And the one you've lost to is yourself. If your audience is listening to you at all, they're not dumb. They're listening. They're interested if they're listening to you. Okay? They do not have the same background in many cases. I'll tell you this. This is something you've probably run across as I have. The person that is not the one that is most irritating is not the person. It's not the person who doesn't have any science background when you're talking about science. It's the person who has a little tiny bit of science background and thinks they know more than you do. Okay? The person who knows nothing about science and is willing to listen is the best person in the world. Okay? Because this is the person who is going to be going out, they're going to be voting. Okay? They're going to be writing letters in support of NASA. They're going to be making an effort to talk to other people about science, to bring to other events. They're going to be the ones who are giving money to science museums or going to science museums with kids. Okay? That's not dumb. That's what we want. That's the opposite of dumb. So don't ever think dumbing down. Now here is something that, again, I have trouble with, and maybe you have too. You see an article, a science article in the popular press that gets something wrong, okay? And you say, oh, science journalists suck. They're bad. They just get it all, messed up. Science journalists can't be trusted to get it right. So there's no value in science journalism because they just can't be fussed to get it right. And then some journalists say, oh, we get these press releases that are hyping results, that are making a big deal about something that isn't really a big deal. Perspective. Bad journalists aren't listening to your criticism. They're already at the pub. I stole this from Ed Young, who's a good science journalist. But I also beg your patience a little bit too on behalf of my science journalist colleagues, because you are an expert in your particular area, okay? A journalist like me, I may write a story about a very high-level esoteric topic in particle physics one day, and about the atmosphere of Titan the next day, and about black holes the next day, and about some ultra-cold atomic physics the following day. Okay, that's not unusual for journalists. We have to be a little bit of an expert in a lot of different areas. And so sometimes we will get it wrong. Okay, it's not out of malice if we're a good journalist. If we're a bad journalist, you're not going to reach us anyway. But do not assume malice on the part of journalists if we screw up, okay? Because we will. But what about getting it right? This is, again, one of my favorite XKCDs. You know something. That's great. You know something that somebody else doesn't know. What better chance than to tell somebody else about what you know. There is no moment more thrilling than to be able to say, I can share something with you that you didn't know before. Whether that's something that you've just discovered, or something that you know very well but isn't common knowledge, or even if it's fairly common knowledge but just isn't known by that particular listener, you are doing a great thing by reaching out and saying, here's something new, here's something wonderful. Carl Sagan said, somewhere something is wonderful is waiting to be known. And sometimes you may know that and the person you're talking to doesn't, okay? You are doing something wonderful by helping them find that new thing. And so a closing thought from a great physicist and mathematician, Henri Poincaré. Remember that science is not just facts. Science is made of facts, but to say that a pile of facts is science is not a correct thing. Okay? Remember you're human. Remember your love. Remember your love of science when you're talking to people. Remember the kid who loved Voyager 2. Or if you weren't the kid who loved Voyager 2, remember the moment when science really became something that clicked for you, something that inspired you, something that brought something to your mind, to your life, that made you want to achieve great things, or just made you so intensely curious that you couldn't rest until you learned more and more and more. Ultimately, that to me is the lesson of science communication, is remembering that the person you're talking to is no different than you are, ultimately. Different backgrounds, perhaps, but we all share common humanity. And so by communicating science, what we're doing is we are making our own science. We're reminding ourselves of why we do what we do. We're making our own science more broadly interesting. We are providing ourselves a little bit of needed humility at times. But most of all, we are helping to make sure that we ourselves have perspective. Thank you.
Can I take any questions?
Yeah, I know you said you really don't like the rubber sheet metaphor. Do you have an example of one that might work better? I'm just curious.
The one that I've seen that I like a lot, and I've been working on, I've actually been working on it's not original to me, and I don't even know who came up with it. But a metaphor I really like is a river, a current. Okay, space-time is a current. If you sit still, the current will carry you right into the black hole. If you have a bit of tangential motion, a bit of oblique motion, it'll carry you around in an orbit. Okay, so the current is what carries you along. But if you reach a point where, what was that?
Because it gives you a feeling that the space is pushing it doesn't.
What's carrying you along?
No, it doesn't. There's no force in space.
No, it's just carrying you along. You're sitting in a boat. You're sitting in a boat.
It doesn't push. It doesn't carry you. You can see it. You can move it. It doesn't. It's still the same journey. I mean, it's very difficult to do some kind of feeling of that, replacement one metaphor with another one. And this is one of the worst parts.
I don't agree, but we say you can. Yes.
The way you said at the start was it's okay to lie as long as you tell people you're lying.
Yes.
So if you're going to use an analogy like the rubber sheet, it's okay to use it because it's blind, but as long as you tell people in advance.
Oh, sure, and it's the same with the river.
Following flows,
Yeah.
here they are. So you're not really.
The reason I don't like the rubber sheet is because it's a very static metaphor. But again, no single metaphor is going to fit all cases, and that's fine. It's okay to be imprecise as long as your audience is aware you're being imprecise. We are trained in precision, but you kind of have to get over the idea that when you're speaking in metaphors, when you're speaking in trying to get a level of understanding, trying to build intuition in audiences, it's okay to say stuff that isn't absolutely 100% accurate as long as everybody knows that the metaphor is going to break down. That's perfectly okay.
I feel like when you're initially learning physics, what you're learning isn't 100% accurate either. So when you're learning parabolic motion, you're not calculating air resistance, right? So like the metaphor is essentially like an extension of that.
Yeah.
You know, it's not the entire truth, but where you're at, you don't need the entire truth.
And that's actually a really great way of thinking about it. Thank you, because as we learn more physics, we learn how much of the physics we learned prior was a lie, or rather, not fully truthful.
I think there's like a test of like predicting how things actually work in the world, and physicists do terribly at it. Because you have to like thinking about like how everything mathematically pans out. I'll have to find what that was. It was really funny.
Okay.
It was really.
I'd be interested in seeing that. But I mean, I think it's like when you know that when you know that we idealize all the time, but we don't lie to ourselves that hopefully we don't lie to ourselves that we're idealizing. But we sometimes forget that when we're telling other people. Yeah.
I wonder what you think about how academic institutions in this country work, where you have people who are hired generally who are researchers, and then you get to be teachers.
Well, I hesitate to make strong general statements because I am speaking primarily about speaking to the public here, which is akin to teaching, but not entirely overlapping in most respects. When you're teaching, you have a very specific goal in mind, which is to, on the lowest levels, just to get people to start thinking. But on the higher levels, to turn people into clones of you. Actually, I shouldn't say that with a straight face. I'm being ironic. Irony is a writer's tool. There is. Let's see. I've forgotten your name, but we were talking about Jason. We were talking about the notion that, to a large degree, graduate programs kind of take it as granted that the people who are in them, they're going to get their PhD and they're going to become a professor. Now, I got my PhD and now I'm a full-time writer, who sometimes teaches. I should always mention that, I do teach. But it's, there isn't a single path, there isn't a single way to do things, and maybe we should be a little more gentle with ourselves and with each other on expectations that we're all going to become the best at everything. We're going to be the best researcher, the best teacher, the best fill in the blank of all time, because there's only room for a certain amount of that. But I don't have any general thoughts about academia on that, because that's far tougher than, that's far above my pay scale. They don't pay me enough for that one. So I thought
whatever doesn't fit my attitudes, I'm not going to accept as even possibly could be correct or not. I mean, do you get a lot of, what are the reactions you get to your writing? I mean, do you have ideas on how you would bridge that?
Well, that's a tricky one. Yeah, see, that's a tricky one because, of course, it really does depend on what I am covering. There are certain people who have very definite ideas about certain topics. For example, whenever I've written about, I think I've written about climate change twice, and both times I have been inundated by. I've been inundated. Yeah, I think we lost our presentation. Yeah, why don't we just turn it off? Okay. I'm inundated with people who have very settled ideas that climate change is not real, and they will not accept any evidence to the contrary to that position. Most of the stuff I write about, I don't get that kind of response. Whether it's because people aren't, the same people aren't reading it, they just look for stuff they want to argue with. But I don't get a lot of general anti-science, and I think to a certain degree, general anti-science is less prevalent than it might seem. Now, of course, you can talk to biologists about the attitudes about evolution. I taught the place that I taught before, where I ran the planetarium, was deep in the Bible Belt, where I did have some pushback from parents who did not want me talking about the age of the universe or the actual numbers for the life cycles of stars to their children, because that was undermining their authority, or that was contradictory to what they were learning elsewhere. And that was a tough situation to deal with, because frankly, we're not trained to go into a situation, at least I wasn't, and I'm guessing that probably most people aren't, trained to go into a situation where somebody is going to come back and say, well, I'm just going to refuse to believe anything you say, and I don't want you to say it. Not just I don't accept, because of my religious views, I don't accept that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, but that I don't want you to say it at all. I don't think you should say it. The role of the planetarium is not to have, not to present this information, but to just talk about neutral things, as though there was some line you could draw and say, okay, this set of facts is okay, and this other set is not. And there's not a clear answer to that, because to a certain extent, it can't be solved on an individual level. In the classroom's a different matter, but that's a different story. Yes?
In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Apollo program came to an end sooner than had been anticipated. Missions were canceled, for instance. The issue was that the American public had really just lost interest in the space program. Was that really a fault, if you use the word fault in that context, of NASA's lack of sponsorship for science writers to keep people involved? Or was it more that the people want to be entertained by science, and once they had seen the show, they were ready to move on?
That's a much deeper question than I think I can answer, and I think certainly the specific question of Apollo in that era probably is better answered by an historian than by someone like me. I am not an historian. As for right now, entertainment is obviously a very big expectation of a lot of science writers. And it's fun to write entertaining things, but we want to be informative at the same time. There's the site that I promised to keep my talk PG, so I won't say the entire name of it, but the IF Love Science Facebook page, which is very popular, is primarily images with very little context, and it's an exceedingly popular thing. And it's easy to say, oh, I love science, I love looking at these pictures, without actually needing to go any deeper than that. And that's something that we actually struggle with, my colleagues and I, talking about, how much entertainment do we need to provide along with the real purpose of our writing, of our communication. So long answer for I don't know. That's another part of writing.
There are some things in science that do stay.
Oh yeah.
Dinosaurs, for instance.
And the thing too is, yeah, go ahead. Answer. She was ahead of you.
I guess this is kind of related to that, but going back to the journalist versus scientist thing, one of the things that I have noticed increasing over the last probably decade or so that has been kind of bothering me is the tendency of the headlines of science articles getting more and more catastrophic, especially when it comes to astronomy, as like a book. And I think a lot of people will read the headline without reading the article and then think they know something. So do you have anything to say about that?
That is a big problem, and that's something, this is a dirty secret. Writers typically do not write the headlines, and often do not have any control over what the headline actually says. We can object to the headline, but sometimes it isn't even the editor we work directly with who writes the headline. It might be somebody higher up or in a different office. And so that's a tough problem because the headline is many times, no matter what the headline is, the only thing that many people will ever see of the article. They will not read past the headline. And so if the headline is too dry or too at least too unsensational, then people won't click on the article or they won't read past the headline. If it's, I tend to think online because that's primarily what I write for.
That would be for any paper.
Yeah, it'd be for any magazine. But it even works for journal articles. For technical articles, it's the art of writing a good title is hard, and so you have to balance between being accurate but also being sexy enough that people are going to want to go past that, and that's a hard balance to do. And the problem, of course, is that it is very easy to go too far, and if you're not writing your own headline, you have a limited amount of control over what headline actually gets used. Now, personally, I tend to write headlines that I think are very clever, but are not always informative, so I always have to go back and rewrite them. But it's because you really want the headline to say something about what's in the article. But at the same time, you want people to read it. So sometimes you want to be a little provocative to get people to read it. Whether it works or not, another question.
So I was thinking about when you said, it's okay to lie, you tell them if you're lying, but a lot of the times I've seen that these headlines are basically almost contradictory to what's in the actual article, and it's, sure, maybe the article is telling them that you're lying, but if they don't even read the article,
right,
and all they've read is the lie. And I guess that's what's been really bugging me about this one.
Anyway, looks like you're in Russian.
Yeah, and that's that is a and again that's just a tough problem. And some publications are just going to have more of a problem with that than others. But what I would say is, here's what I would say is, as intelligent consumers, find writers you trust. Okay? Because I find I trust certain writers a lot, and other writers I don't. And so I don't look at the headline, I look at who's written it, and then the headline, and admittedly that's insider knowledge that I know that the writer probably didn't write their own headline. But then what you can do is, I didn't talk about social media except for the story that Twitter wrote. But when you're sharing stories, you don't have to share the headline that's written. You can write your own headline, substitute headline when you're sharing it, and that actually helps a lot. That's often what I will do, is I will not share the actual headline. I'll share my own version of it. But that's only a partial solution.
So I like the fact we have professional science writers. That makes a lot of sense. But I don't actually worry about the general public. I think the general public are interested in science. People I worry about are the politicians. And we don't have professional science writers for politicians. And so when you look at it's politicians who control the budget, not the citizens. And when you look at the politicians coming into positions of power in scientific committees next year, you wouldn't trust them to try to shoot it scientifically, yet alone, not the budget. So do we need a class of writers who can communicate our science to the politicians in a professional way, the same way that we now have a class of writers who can communicate the science to the public?
That kind of person does exist. That kind of writer does exist. People whose job it is to try to talk to politicians. The problem, as always, is access and who else has access. Science is competing with other voices. And if you're more willing to listen to some voices than others and you're a politician, then it's tough. But I agree, there is that need, and that there are people who do that. I wish there were more, and I wish they were more powerful.
That's where the millionaires are.
Well, the politicians, the important thing is their staffers.
Yes.
Yeah, and honestly, they should have science. There should be more scientists on staff. That would be another way. Science communicators, if not scientists. People who can explain science. If you can explain scientists to a member of the House of Representatives, you can probably explain it to anybody. Actually, you can explain it to a senator.
Not to our representative in the House of Representatives.
If you can explain it to a U.S. senator, you're probably doing pretty well.
I think on that note, thank you guys for all your great questions.